So I talked a little bit about different currency systems that we've seen in the international system over time, and I think it maybe be useful to talk through this idea that's been floating around that the BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, might collaborate somehow and create their own new currency that could function as a rival to the dollar-based currency system that's been in place for, in various different iterations since the end of World War II. And this is particularly relevant at this particular moment in the summer of 2023, because in August, the BRICS nations are going to be meeting in Durban, South Africa, and one of the items on the agenda is to preview or highlight or maybe sketch out a rough outline around this idea of creating a BRICS-backed currency, or a BRICS organized currency that might be backed by gold, and trying to figure out what that might actually look like. And so I'd like to talk through a little bit about that, but also sort of whether or not this would actually threaten what sometimes is called the dominance of the dollar or dollar dominance. And I'm both skeptical about the threat that the BRICS currency or a BRICS currency could pose to the dollar, but also kind of kind of expecting that something will come of this, that there are strong motivations why countries might want to go down this road, and we'll kind of talk through what some of that is. But before we get to that, I want to talk about what we mean when we talk about dollar dominance and the decline of dollar dominance, which is periodically forecast every year or so for a variety of different reasons, but really we haven't seen any serious shift. And part of that is that people mean different things when they talk about the dollar dominance. So one way of thinking about the dominance of the dollar is that the dollar has functioned since the end of World War II as the global reserve currency. After the Bretton Woods conference, a system of currency was set up in which the U.S. Linked its currency to gold, and other countries linked their currency to the dollar, and they held dollars in foreign reserves to be able to exchange with their own currency. And so foreign reserve banks around the world, or central banks around the world, held large quantities of dollars. After the Bretton Woods system was sort of abandoned in 1971 and countries began moving away from a fixed exchange rate system to a floating exchange rate system, central banks continued to hold hard currency assets, but it wasn't just dollars. It shifted to more of a market basket. So gold, special drawing rights, euros, yen, pound, as well as dollars. And dollars continue to make up a good chunk of those foreign reserves held by central banks around the world. But it's not the only currency that's used for sort of stabilizing the currency systems within states and how they interact with each other. So a global reserve currency is one way that dollar dominance gets talked about. Another way that gets talked about is in terms of pricing of key goods. So in particular, oil historically has been priced in dollars, which is really convenient for the United States because it doesn't have to worry about currency fluctuations adjusting its ability to purchase oil. But in recent years, there have been conversations between Saudi Arabia and others like China about possibly pricing oil in other currencies like the RMB. This is fine. In my view, this has very little to do with undercutting dollar dominance. As long as the dollar still functions as a currency that you can purchase major commodities in, we're just shuffling things around in terms of how these financial transactions play out. A final way that the dollar has really entrenched itself in the international system, and I would say this is probably the most important and most enduring mechanism, is that the dollar gets used by financial institutions all around the world to settle accounts. So when I buy and sell and shift money internationally, or I want to move my rubles into rupees, that typically would mean those rubles get turned into dollars by a financial institution, they get transferred, and then the dollars get turned into rupees on the other end of that financial transaction. And so dollars sit at sort of the core of how money moves around the international system, to the point where I think 90% of all international transactions get routed through dollars in this way. The dollars are not just the reserve currency that's held by central banks, it's the medium of exchange for international financial transactions primarily. Okay, so different ways people are talking about this, and I'm laying this out because I want to talk about different ways that a BRICS currency could function, what it could look like, and how it would affect dollar dominance. And so one mechanism or one strategy that BRICS countries could do is they could try to create a market basket currency out of their collective currencies that could function as foreign reserves that would be held by central banks around the world. So that it would reduce the amount of dollars that central banks potentially would have on hand, because they would have this new asset slash currency sort of special drawing right kind of concept that the International Monetary Fund came up with, that they could put on their books and hold as a foreign reserve asset. And this could work, getting other countries to hold this special new asset. Why would this be something that a country would want? Well, it would potentially weaken the value or the desirability of the dollar as a reserve currency. Other countries would be able to hold something else in place of it. They could currently hold euros or yen, but this would be another option. The other reason why this would potentially be useful is that it would help facilitate option number 2, which is to build up a more robust network of financial arrangements so that countries don't have to route their currencies through dollars, so that my rubles can be turned into rupees through a different medium of exchange, this BRICS currency, and financial institutions could use that as an alternative. And this is really appealing to countries like Russia, which have faced intense sanctions as a result of the invasion of Ukraine. And this would give them a mechanism around a lot of those sanctions, that they could have access to financial institutions, that they could have access to trade without sanctions imposed by the United States biting quite as hard against them. So there's potentially desirability for this on the part of Russia and probably others as well. And the final option for a BRICS currency would be to create a new fixed exchange rate system. All the talk seems to be about gold, and I haven't figured out if that's because the people who are really excited about this tend to really like the idea of a gold standard. There's a lot of logistical problems to be worked out on that. But again, it's the kind of thing that countries are interested in, particularly developing countries who've long been frustrated at currency volatility and how that can affect their economy. And so there is an appeal amongst developing countries for this kind of a currency system. But that having been said, there are some real trade-offs that come with establishing a fixed exchange rate system where the BRICS nations would be fixing their currency in terms of gold. And so it's worth revisiting this idea of the impossible trinity, that there are 3 things you might desire in a currency system, but you can only really have 2 at any given point in time if you want that system to remain stable, right? You can have fixed exchange rates. We like that. That provides stability. We know what our currency is worth. We know what it's worth relative to other things. That's great. We might want sovereign monetary policy, the ability to set interest rates higher or lower for the good of our own economy, to manage inflation, to reduce unemployment. That's a desirable thing. And we might want free capital flows, so that money can come in and go out of our economy, so that we can attract international investment. Typically, with a gold standard system, at least something that would look like the Bretton Woods system, countries have to give up free capital flows. For some countries like China, that's fine. China already has capital controls in place. They don't allow money to go in and come out, without restrictions, and so that's maybe not a problem. Other countries who maybe have more ties to the global economy and to global financial markets, particularly, might chafe at that and giving that up, and might attempt to hold on to that, which would potentially be dangerous in terms of currency stability, because you can reach a point if too much money is going out, that your central bank runs out of currency to make a transaction at that fixed exchange rate, and you can have a currency crisis, a balance payment crisis, and a default. Capital controls are one mechanism to stop that, but it's not perfect. Over time, differences in the economic growth and the exports and imports that countries experience can result in some countries accumulating more in terms of foreign reserves, in terms of that backing asset, the BRICS currency, if that's what we're talking about, and some countries having less of that available. And if you end up running out, that's a serious problem. Suddenly you're not able to convert your currency and the whole currency system collapses for you. The solution to that, of course, is to have a lender of last resort, an organization like the International Monetary Fund that can step in and provide short-term or even medium or long-term loans to inject hard currency or that special asset, that BRICS-backed currency or whatever it's going to be, into countries that have had these balance of payment crises so that they can right the ship, reduce imports, increase exports, balance things in a way that is more sustainable. So there are some real trade-offs that are going to come with trying to create a fixed exchange rate system backed by gold, above and beyond the conversation about whether gold is actually a good mechanism to use to anchor currency because its supply is fixed. And over time, as countries grow and their economies grow, in theory, you're going to need more currency in circulation to be able to facilitate economic transactions. And if you don't have that and currency starts becoming scarce relative to the demand for it, its purchasing power goes up, which sounds good, except that when that happens over a protracted period of time, you end up with deflation, which is economically devastating. And so countries that have been on a gold standard system over the long haul have experienced these boom and bust cycles that are really volatile and really destructive. So I'm skeptical for a variety of reasons that we will see a gold-backed BRICS currency emerging anytime in the foreseeable future. It'll probably be talked about because it's an interesting and intriguing idea that I think appeals to a number of developing countries that have been they've struggled with some of the volatility in foreign exchange markets, but I'm a little bit skeptical. That having been said, I want to toss out some, I guess, random-ish observations that I think are part of this story, but don't necessarily add up to a whole, but I think are part of the larger conversation we had around this. So I mentioned that many developing states would like to see a more stable currency. So there is definitely demand for this. There's also demand because countries like Russia want to be able to escape from sanctions and want an alternative to that. There's also pushback on the part of China that would like to see alternatives to the dollar and potentially weakening of the United States, not just out of typical great power rivalry, but also because there hasn't really been a place for China within the sort of Western-dominated international financial institutions, even though China's economy has grown significantly in the past 40, 50 years. And so to give you a sense of what this looks like, so in the International Monetary Fund, countries get a certain voting allocation based on agreements about what they're going to contribute in. The United States contributes in, I think, like 15 to 18% and gets 15 to 18% of the vote share, which essentially gives the United States a veto over International Monetary Fund decisions, which require an 85% supermajority in order to act. China is sitting at less than 5% of the contributions into the International Monetary Fund, and therefore less than 5% of the votes to make decisions in the International Monetary Fund, which is not unreasonable when the International Monetary Fund was created or when it was reformed in the 1970s. But China's economy is now 22, 24, 25% of the global economy, and it still has this very tiny share of International Monetary Fund influence and votes. After the Great Recession, there was an effort to reform the voting formula to give China a greater say and greater influence in the International Monetary Fund, and the United States blocked that. Understandably, China was frustrated and has sought to build up alternative financial institutions and vehicles, whether it's the Asian Development Bank, I think there's an Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, or potentially this new currency BRICS system to create new alternative financial institutions and forms for cooperation that actually give China a voice as opposed to the legacy institutions, the Bretton Woods system. Okay, so that's a second sort of piece of what's going on. I'll throw out another sort of random observation that a decline in dollar dominance might actually not be bad for the United States. One of the consequences of countries holding large quantities of dollars in their central banks and as foreign reserves is that it increases demand for the dollar, which keeps the dollar artificially high or strong relative to other currencies, which makes it harder for the United States to export. And so what we've seen is that the US's manufacturing base over the last 50, 60, 70 years has slowly eroded away. A decline in dollar dominance, particularly in terms of foreign reserve holdings, would potentially weaken the dollar relative to other currencies. It would make borrowing more expensive for the United States, most likely, but it would also make US exporters more competitive, which might not be a bad thing. So there's trade-offs in terms of how these things balance. I'll flag two more things. So one factor is that international financial institutions require a level of cooperation. And to make a system like this works requires states to be able to work well together, right? So that's what the International Monetary Fund does. That's what the G7 does. But the G7 is made up of countries that are all linked together as part of the US alliance system. They're all democracies. They're all industrialized. They have significant level of trade amongst themselves. BRICS aren't like that. The acronym BRICS actually comes from a report that was developed by a Goldman Sachs analyst who highlighted Brazil, Russia, India, and China as large economies that were developing and would likely be good investment or good growth potential. It would have good growth potential in the coming years. And so these were BRICS, plural, with the S being lowercase, and South Africa sort of jumped on this bandwagon and said, no, the S actually should stand for South Africa. And so this was a collection of states that didn't come together out of geostrategic economic alignment. They came together because a Goldman Sachs analyst made an acronym that's spelled incorrectly in English but sounds kind of cool and led to people thinking about this as an alternative economic block of some kind. And I'm flagging this not to say this isn't a real thing, not that it's arbitrary. Well, it is arbitrary, but it is a real thing in that the BRICS nations meet. They regularly hold forums and discussions very similar to the G7. It's a large economic bloc. They're bringing in other countries all the time to participate in these meetings. But there are deep divides within the BRICS nations, both in terms of where they're at economically and what they want and need economically, but also in terms of geostrategic rivalry. Right? India and China are not close partners. They have a territorial dispute. They periodically come to blows. This is not a harmonious relationship, and that ends up being important if we sort of circle back to that idea of hegemonic stability theory, that it requires a large, powerful state to be able to anchor global economic infrastructure. And if you don't have that, you have to be able to anchor it in international cooperation. And the BRICS may not be the vehicle to facilitate long-term economic cooperation, the kind that would be needed to deal with currency crises, to deal with balance payments crises, to make the currency system function well over the long haul. That having been said, I think there's one last piece that's worth highlighting, and that is that there probably is significant demand for an alternative to the dollar. Over the last, since the end of the Great Recession, the election of President Obama, there has been a series of brinksmanship showdowns between congressional Republicans and Democratic presidents over raising of the debt ceiling. This is I would say archaic, but it's not even that archaic. It's just an extra law that says that the United States cannot borrow additional money above a certain threshold, and periodically Congress steps in and raises that threshold. The problem is that if the Congress doesn't raise that threshold, that when bills come in to be paid by the Treasury, if they can't borrow, they can't pay those bills. And so all of the debt that the United States has accumulated over the years, that's out in the world, that's on the balance books of banks and of central banks and of people's retirement savings, all of that suddenly gets called into question about whether or not payments will actually be made, whether there's the ability to actually pay that off. And so the regular brinksmanship where Congress threatens to essentially default on U.S. debt, I think has created a sense that maybe holding U.S. dollars isn't as stable as it had been perceived. and that diversifying the global economy away from the dollar, given the political dysfunction in the United States, may not be a bad idea long term. And so again, if you are a developing country, you have all sorts of reasons why you might desire something like a BRICS-backed currency. If you are a BRICS nation, you might have reasons to desire a BRICS-backed currency. But there are some deep problems in terms of facilitating international economic cooperation to make that work that I'm skeptical, that give me greater skepticism than optimism about this sort of thing actually coming to fruition.